You ever notice how every few years there's a new revolution that's supposed to change everything? Like we're all supposed to wake up one day and boom, everything's different. Flying cars, robot butlers, food pills instead of dinner, that sort of thing. Well, something caught my attention lately, and it's one of those revolutions that's been hyped up for a while now: electric vehicles. You know, Teslas, Rivians, those little electric Hyundais you see zipping around, even the F-150 Lightning. For years, we've been told the EV revolution is here, it's inevitable, and soon we'll all be plugging in instead of filling up. But lately, I keep hearing this new narrative bubbling up. The EV revolution is failing, and nobody wants to admit it. Now that's a pretty bold claim, right? It's the kind of thing that makes you stop and wonder, wait, is it really failing? Or is this just the latest round of internet drama? So I started digging, talking to friends, reading up, watching what's happening in the news, and honestly, the story is way more interesting and way more complicated than just winning or failing. Before I really get into it, by the way, if you're into these kinds of deep dives where we peel back the headlines and really look at what's going on, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I promise we keep it real here. No hype, no doom scrolling, just honest, thoughtful conversations. All right, let's get into it. So let's just set the scene for a second. Think back, maybe 5 or 10 years ago. Electric cars were still kind of a novelty, right? Maybe you knew someone who had a Tesla, or you saw a Nissan Leaf in the Whole Foods parking lot, but for most people, EVs were something you read about, not something you actually drove. But then, seemingly overnight, things started to shift. Tesla became a household name. Ford and GM started rolling out their own electric trucks and SUVs. Even luxury brands like Mercedes and BMW jumped in. The message was everywhere. The future is electric. Gas is out, batteries are in. And honestly, for a while, it really did look like the world was changing fast. I mean, the numbers are pretty wild. Last year, so 2024, over 17 million electric cars were sold worldwide. That's not a typo. 17 million. That's about 1 out of every 5 new cars sold globally, running on batteries instead of gasoline. And if you look at the projections for this year, 2025, we're probably going to hit 20 million. That's 1 in 4 new cars. If you'd told me that back in 2015, I would have laughed. It's like, yeah, sure, and we'll all have jetpacks too. But here's where it gets interesting. Even with those massive sales numbers, there's this growing sense, especially in the US, that the EV revolution is hitting some serious speed bumps. People are starting to ask, wait, is this really working, or is the whole thing stalling out? And depending on who you talk to, you'll get wildly different answers. Some folks will tell you, it's over, nobody wants EVs, the whole thing's a flop. Others will say, no, this is just a temporary slowdown. The future is still electric, it's just taking a little longer to get there. So what's actually going on? Is the EV revolution really failing, or is this just another case of the internet losing its mind over nothing? Well, let's break it down. First off, let's talk about where all those EVs are actually being sold, because, surprise, it's not the same everywhere. China, for example, is absolutely crushing it. I mean, they are way ahead of the game. Almost half of all new cars sold in China are electric. That's wild. Imagine walking down the street and every other car you see is running on batteries. And it's not just Teslas or fancy imports either. There are tons of Chinese brands, BYD, NIO, XPeng, making affordable, practical EVs that regular people can actually buy. Europe's doing pretty well too. Over there, about 1 in 5 new cars is electric, and in some countries, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, it's even higher. In Norway, it's basically weird if you don't drive an EV. They've got charging stations everywhere, tons of government support, and people are genuinely excited about ditching gas. Now the US, that's where things get a little more complicated. We're not doing badly exactly. About 1 in 10 new cars sold here is electric, and in places like California, it's more like 1 in 4. But outside of those big coastal cities, it's a different story. There are a lot of places where people just aren't buying in. Maybe they're worried about charging, maybe they don't trust the technology, maybe they just like their trucks the way they are. Whatever the reason, the growth isn't as fast as some people hoped. And that's where a lot of the EVs are failing talk comes from. It's not that nobody's buying them, it's that the growth isn't happening everywhere all at once.
And honestly, that makes sense. America's a big, diverse country. What works in San Francisco or New York isn't always going to work in rural Texas or the Midwest.
People have different needs, different habits, different priorities, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because even with the slower growth in some places, EV sales are still going up. They're not crashing, they're not disappearing. It's just not the overnight takeover that some of the hype made it out to be. Now, let's talk about some of the real challenges that are making this transition harder than people expected. Because, let's be honest, switching from gas to electric isn't as simple as flipping a switch. There are a lot of moving parts. First up, charging. This is the big one. If you live in a city, maybe you've got a charger in your garage, or there's one at work, or you can find one at the grocery store. But for a lot of people, especially if you live in an apartment or in a rural area, or you don't have a driveway, charging is a real headache. The infrastructure just isn't there yet. And even when you do find a charger, sometimes it's broken, or it's in use, or it's just slow. I've heard stories of people driving around for an hour trying to find a working charger, and that's just not sustainable if you're trying to get to work or pick up your kids. And it's not just an American problem. In India, for example, half of the public chargers reportedly don't even work. Imagine if half the gas stations in your city were out of order. People would lose their minds. Then there's the question of cost. EVs are getting cheaper, but they're still more expensive up front than a lot of gas cars. Sure, you save money on gas and maintenance over time, but not everyone can shell out $40,000 or $50,000 for a new car, even if it's going to save them money in the long run. And with interest rates where they are right now, financing a new car isn't exactly a walk in the park. Plus, there's all this uncertainty around government incentives. One year, there's a big tax credit for buying an EV. The next year, maybe it's gone, or it only applies to certain models, or there's a bunch of paperwork. It's confusing, and it makes people hesitant. Nobody wants to buy a car and then find out they missed out on a $7,500 rebate because they checked the wrong box. Let's not forget about the automakers themselves. Some of them are struggling to keep up. You've got legacy car companies, Ford, GM, Volkswagen, trying to pivot from a century of building gas engines to making batteries and electric motors. That's not easy. There have been layoffs, factory closures, production delays. Some companies are pulling back on their EV plans, at least for now, because they're not seeing the profits they hoped for. And then you've got these new players, Rivian, Lucid, Fisker, trying to break in, but it's a tough market, and not everyone's going to make it. Meanwhile, over in China, you've got companies cranking out affordable EVs at a pace that's honestly kind of scary for the competition. They're selling cars for $10,000, $15,000, and they're pretty good. That's putting a lot of pressure on American and European automakers to step up their game or risk getting left behind. And then there's the consumer side of things. People are curious about EVs, but they're also skeptical. There's range anxiety, that fear that you'll run out of battery before you find a charger. There are worries about how long the batteries will last, how much it'll cost to replace them, whether the technology will be obsolete in a few years. Some people have had bad experiences, chargers that don't work, cars that don't live up to the hype, and that sticks with them. Word of mouth is powerful. If your neighbor says their EV is a hassle, you're probably going to think twice before buying one yourself. And let's be real, there's also a cultural element. For a lot of Americans, cars are about more than just getting from point A to point B. They're about freedom, independence, road trips, tailgating, hauling stuff. There's a whole identity wrapped up in pickup trucks and muscle cars and the open road. Asking people to give that up for something that feels unfamiliar or maybe even a little bit preachy is a tough sell. But here's the thing. Even with all these challenges, the EV market is still growing. Maybe not as fast as some people predicted, maybe not in every single corner of the country, but it's not going away. In fact, globally, it's accelerating. The world is buying more EVs than ever before. China and Europe are leading the way, but even here in the US, the numbers keep going up. So why does it feel like the revolution is stalling out? I think part of it is expectations.
When something gets hyped up as the next big thing, anything less than total, instant success feels like a letdown. We want things to change overnight, but real change takes time. It's messy, it's uneven, and there are always bumps in the road. Another part of it is the way the story gets told. Headlines love drama. EVs are failing gets more clicks than EVs are growing, but it's complicated. Social media amplifies the loudest voices, whether they're cheering or complaining.
And honestly, it's easy to get caught up in the noise and lose sight of the bigger picture. But if you zoom out, the story is actually pretty optimistic. The technology is getting better, batteries are lasting longer, charging is getting faster, prices are coming down. More and more automakers are committing to electric, and the infrastructure is slowly but surely catching up. It's not happening overnight, but it is happening. And let's not forget the environmental side of things. One of the big promises of EVs is that they'll help fight climate change by cutting down on emissions. That's true, eventually, but it depends on where your electricity comes from. If you're charging your car with coal power, the benefits aren't as big as if you're using solar or wind. That's another piece of the puzzle that needs work. But as the grid gets cleaner, the impact of EVs will get bigger. So, is the EV revolution failing? Not really. It's just complicated. It's a work in progress. There are real challenges, and not every market is moving at the same speed. Some automakers are struggling, some consumers are skeptical, some regions are lagging behind. But the overall trend is still upward. More people are buying EVs every year. The technology is improving. The infrastructure is expanding. It's not a straight line, but it's not a collapse either. If you're thinking about getting an EV, or you're just curious about where things are headed, my advice is keep an open mind. Don't buy into the hype, but don't buy into the doom and gloom either. Look at what's actually happening. Talk to people who've made the switch. Take a test drive if you can. The future isn't set in stone, but it's definitely electric. And hey, if you made it this far, thanks for hanging out with me. I love digging into these big, messy topics, and I hope you got something out of it. If you want to keep the conversation going, don't forget to subscribe and let me know what you think. Are you excited about EVs? Skeptical? Somewhere in between? I want to hear your stories. All right, that's it for today. Go out, look at the cars around you, and just imagine what things might look like in another 5 or 10 years. Will we all be plugging in? Will gas stations turn into charging lounges? Will pickup trucks go electric? Or will we find some new way to get around entirely? Who knows? But one thing's for sure, the road ahead is going to be interesting. And I, for one, can't wait to see where it takes us.